So I'm doing one on parables today. I just thought that this was something that I woke up with early this morning, saying that this was a good idea to go through. I know when I went through the New Testament studies with the Gospels, I looked at them all together, and I really didn't get into the details of the teachings as much as the overview. And so I thought I'd look at some of these parables. There's a link in the description, as always, to the material I'm using. And so this was a handy list that I came across, and let me roll back. I'm just going to kind of go through these just because I think they do a good job of an overview. It's really kind of advertising a book that you can get for teaching in a church setting or a small group, but they give the detail here too as well, so no big deal there. And I thought, I haven't really gone through all of these. I'm familiar with the parables, but I am not familiar with this website. Don't necessarily agree with everything. I haven't even looked at it. So, but this was a spur of the moment thing. So they start off, the parables of Jesus embody much of his fundamental teaching, quite simple, memorable stories, often with humble imagery. That is to say, having to do with their agrarian farming society mostly. Each with a single message. Jesus, for example, likened the kingdom of God to yeast, an image usually meant as corruption or a mustard seed, like his aphorisms, which are just, pithy sayings. Jesus' parables were often surprising and paradoxical. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, turned expectations on their head, with the despised Samaritan proving to be the wounded man's neighbor. The parables were simple and memorable enough to survive in an oral tradition before being written down years after Jesus' death. Most Bible scholars say that Jesus' parables appear only in the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. However, if we broaden our view a bit, it seems that Jesus' three-part story about the sheep, gate, and shepherd in John 10 can also be considered a parable, as it chronologically falls right after the related parables of the lost sheep in Matthew 18:12-14. So he's also referencing the NIV narrated Bible in chronological order and the Daily Bible chronological order, and that where you can get those. But he says this person, I don't know if he or she, I didn't look, but the person writing this article makes a good point. Chronology is quite a lesson by itself. That is to say, the order of the parables as told to us in the Gospels. He says the first group of parables focuses on the fact that there's a new story being told that's not to be hidden, and it serves as a foundation for what's coming next. We then have the very important parables. He's got them numbered. They're not numbered in the Bible, but number 12, sower and 4 types of soil, and number 13, the weeds among good plants. This is followed by a group of kingdom of heaven parables, growing seed, yeast, valuable pearl, etc. Now that the foundation has been built, Jesus gets into the behavior parables, how he would have you act as a Christian in different situations as a disciple, worker, or tenant. He then moves into using your talents well, remaining watchful, and finally into judgment. Basically, it's the progression of a Christian life. Unfortunately, it's a progression we miss out on when we read the parables in the order they appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So he has grouped the order, and that's perfectly fine because the Gospels are not necessarily written in chronological order, not just the order of the books in the Bible canon, but also the order that things are recorded. They're not always the same. And the reason is that the historians of the day did not concern themselves as much with chronology of detail and so forth, but with putting the reader in the story because of oral traditions and because that this history was a lesson, not just a bit of dry data. So this is important that we recognize the different parables he told, and that the way or position they're recorded in the text is not necessarily even the order in which Jesus told them. So I'm going to skip down some of the how to use this as a lesson thing and just look at their list here. I might go into some of these a little bit from memory, but you can read them in your favorite version. A lot of people have problems with the one I did or the ones that I prefer to read. But I like clarity and I like accuracy. And the Middle English of the King James doesn't meet those criteria for me a lot of times. Anyway, so we'll do the paraphrase things that every preacher does, even in a very staunch King James only church. They will paraphrase things for you to help you understand, because you wouldn't get that just from the King James itself, or you wouldn't need preachers. They never seem to think about that. So the parables 1 through 4, according to this list, have to do with new things, as mentioned earlier: new cloth, new wine, lamp on a stand, wise and foolish builders. The new cloth and the new wine has to do with not mixing old and new. So right off the bat in Jesus' teachings, he's talking about the fact that something new was about to happen. People today even like to think that Jesus only came to put the Jews back on track with the laws of Moses, but clearly he's talking about something fundamentally different by talking about new. You don't put a piece of new cloth to repair an old garment, because the new one will shrink and tear and make the hole even bigger that you were trying to fix before. Likewise, the same lesson with the parable of the wineskins. He's saying that you don't put new wine to old wineskins, or the wine will expand and break the skin and all the wine will spill out. So he's saying, don't mix the old and the new. Don't try to put new things into old containers. Don't try to put the message that the Messiah was about to bring and then demonstrate and enact a new covenant in his blood, as he put it, at his death and resurrection. Don't try to put that into the laws of Moses. That's the lesson, the first lesson, the fundamental lesson that he taught in his parables. Then 5 and 6, he groups as the moneylender for giving unequal debts, and a lamp on the stand the second time. I'm not sure why he does the lampstand thing in 2 different lists, but the thing is that with the moneylender, if it's the one I'm thinking of, there are a couple of them, it has more to do with people not showing the same forgiveness that they have received. In other words, if Jesus forgives you of your sins and keeps you from having to spend eternity away from God, but you won't forgive people who owe you $5 or something like that, then God will not forgive you, even though he had before, because Jesus said, whatever measure you use to judge others, God will use on you at the judgment. So the lesson clearly is that however you treat other people in this life is the measuring stick that will be used on you for your own life. So there will be no double standards. Then the number 7 and 8 that they have here, the rich man builds bigger barns, servants must remain watchful. What that is, the rich man is someone who was thinking, I have plenty of food laid up for many years. I'm going to just kick back and party and not think about the poor or anything like that. And then in the parable, Jesus says that God, once the guy says this thing, that God says, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get all this stuff? So our lives are short, and we're not here because we're in charge of anything, really, but because we're here to see what we will do with what belongs to God. And this kind of ties in with the demand of a lot of people that where is God when such and such happens, and why does he sit there folding his arms and doing nothing? When in fact it will be God. Jesus, is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. The Bible says that all the deity dwells in him. He will be the one coming back to say, what have you done with what I gave you? And it will be our fault that things were not done that should have been done. So he will be our judge. We won't be his. And he will demand to know why we didn't help the poor, why we didn't step in and rescue the oppressed. So that's the lesson of those parables. And then 9 and 10, the wise and foolish servants, unfruitful fig tree, excuse me. Those both have to do with the fact that a wise servant, which is what a good follower of Jesus would be until he returns, doesn't slack off because the master is gone a long time. They do what they're tasked to do when they're tasked to do it, and not because and not slack off because nobody's watching at the moment. Those are foolish servants, and just like the fig tree, a tree that doesn't bear fruit is uprooted and burned. So in the same way, even though this life is temporary, and even though this is not the end all be all of our existence, that this is just the warm up and the test and the place where we choose where we want to spend eternity. It is our choice in the end. What he's saying here in these parables is that how we live is the most important thing, not necessarily what we accomplish. It's the kind of character we build. With the seeds in the sower, number 11 they have here, it's a very interesting parable, and I think I might go and look for that. Let me open a new tab and look for Bible. Let's see. We'll just get that one and do a search on soil. Be able to find it. That's Matthew 13. So we'll go to Matthew 13 and find that parable. And then, oh, this is interesting too. Just before that, the disciples asked Jesus, why do you speak to them in object lessons or parables? Let me blow that up a bit. And he says, the secrets of the kingdom of the heavens have been revealed to you, but not to them. He replied, for more will be given to those who already have, and they will have plenty, but from those who have little, what they have will be taken away. So I speak to them in object lessons because no matter how much they see and hear, they don't understand. In other words, it depends on the kind of person that you tell parables so that it will stick with those who are open to the truth. And he's about to illustrate that point with these parables, you know, with a parable just to explain what it is about parables. I skip down a bit. Pay attention to the object lesson or parable of the seed being scattered. This is his explanation of the seeds in the sower. And briefly, what that was is a farmer goes out to scatter seed, and some of the seed falls on the walking path, the hard rock path. Some of it falls into the shallow soil along the edge. Some of it falls into better soil, but it is quickly choked out by weeds, or not necessarily quickly, but eventually choked out by weeds. And then some soil falls, or some seeds falls in good soil where it produces much more than what you planted. And his disciples didn't get it, so they asked him, and now he's going to explain it to them. Then he says, some who hear the message of the kingdom don't understand it, so the evil one snatches away the message from their minds. This relates to the seeds falling along the edges of the path. Sorry about edges. Instead of right on the surface, I misremembered that. Sorry. The seeds that fell on rocky soil relates to those who hear the message and gladly accept it right away. But because they're shallow and have no root, they don't last long. When the problems and tests of life come along, the message planted in them is quickly sidetracked. The seeds falling among the thorns relates to those who hear the message, but the anxieties of life and the allure of wealth choke it out, so they produce nothing. But the seeds that fell onto good soil relate to those who hear the message and understand it, so they produce a good crop up to 30, 60, or even 100 times more than what was planted. Now, the other parable that is on the list is right after that in this passage in Matthew. Here's another one of his parables or object lessons. The kingdom of the heavens is like someone who scattered good seed in his field. But during the night, while everyone was asleep, his enemy came and scattered wheat weeds or tares all over the place and went away. So when the grain sprouted and grew, so did the weeds. Then the workers went to the owner and told him, "Sir, didn't you plant good seed in your field? So where did all these wheat weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. "Do you want us to go and pull them out?" asked the workers. "No," he answered. "In the process of pulling the weeds, you might accidentally uproot the wheat. Let them all grow together until the harvest. Then I'll tell the reapers, first gather up the weeds and tie them into bundles to be burned, and then gather up the wheat and put it in my silo." So there we have two lessons about things that grow together, all growing lessons. And the second one, of course, is that good and evil are going to coexist. They have to, because otherwise for whatever reason, the good might be damaged. And yet the good and the evil are very difficult at times to tell apart because evil is hidden. And sometimes even good is hidden. People don't know the good that other people are doing. And so there is an end time harvest that we're reading about at Flat Out Elected regarding the final judgments. And it is only then when it's very obvious to the angels between, I guess, who are serving as being represented by the workers in the field, which are good and which are evil, and then they can be separated. And we're even seeing that now, the very idea of separating good from evil, in that it's becoming more obvious which is which, and because the grain is really ripening, then we know we're at the end and near the time of the harvest. So that's what those are about. And then the next parables are 16 through 19 about hidden treasure, the pearl of great price, and the fishing net, and the owner of a house, the kingdom of heaven. If you go and read those, and they have references to all these things, you can click on these links if you don't know where these are. And the hidden treasure is about people finding, having something of value and then finding something of better value and trading it. And so Jesus, here again, like the early parables of old and new, is saying that, yeah, you've had something from God, it was the law, but now you're going to, if you have a brain in your head, you're going to discard it and pick up something better, which is the promise that came before the law. I think that's what's going on with those, give up what you have for something better parables. The lost sheep, the sheep gate and shepherd, Numbers 20 and 21. This is where Jesus says that he's, a shepherd is out in the field watching 100 sheep. One strays off, and the shepherd will go and leave the flock and go look for that one and carry it back to safety. So this is the same idea of any family where, if a child wanders off, you go out frantically looking for that child and give them a lot of attention when you find them, because it's not that you love them more than the other children. It's that this one was in danger of being lost, and you're so overjoyed that they're found again that it seems to the other ones they may get jealous. This is also going to be the parable of the prodigal son. We'll see down there in number 31. So that I'll get to that, I guess, when I go through their list here. Unmerciful servants, masters and servants. This is again having to do with faithfully serving God even when you think he's not watching, and not to mistreat your fellow servants. I see that all the time. And this is a really big problem that's going on right now, because Christians shoot the body of Christ in the foot and shoot their wounded, and do more tearing apart of each other, and then wonder why the Christian message isn't getting out. I have a prime example of that here. And this is the video that was done by Dean Odell about, at that conference. And he's talking about how he was heckled and hated and treated very unkindly by people who pretend to be neutral and accepting. And I've pointed out before that the person who heckled was defended and saying that she was just speaking her mind, yet somehow this Christian man was not allowed to speak his mind because they found it offensive. Never mind what Christians find offensive. And here we have this person who is insulting me for pointing out that there was a sub-discussion about, that I made a point about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit claimed by Pastor Oldie, I pronounce it right, I'm sorry, it's Odell. I don't mean to do that. It was just the first way I pronounced it before somebody told me how it was. So Odell, and he said that the Holy Spirit is masculine because the Holy Spirit fathered Jesus in Mary. But the whole point of the virgin birth is that no man would be involved. And spirits do not have gender. I know even New Agers believe that spirits have gender. So this would be more of a New Agey teaching to say that God or the Holy Spirit is masculine. And it is just as bad to say that as it is to say the spirit is feminine. It's neither. It's spirit, not flesh, does not reproduce. There is no need for gender if you don't reproduce. And so this person was looking only at English, saying these are masculine pronouns. That's an English problem, not a Greek problem, and certainly not a Hebrew problem either. I've pointed out before, as I did in an earlier comment, that they're not either male or female, and that in Hebrew, the noun for spirit, wind, or breath, they're all the same word in both. In Hebrew, they're all the same word. In Greek, they're a different same word. those are feminine in Hebrew. So you would properly use she in the Old Testament, referring to the Spirit. But in the New Testament, in Greek, you would use the neuter pronoun because pneumos is a neuter noun. And so you would properly say it. And I think even the King James says it for the Spirit. The only time it says he is when the word is comforter, because comforter is a masculine noun, no matter which comforter it's talking about. So the whole issue of trying to put masculinity into the Godhead, except for the human Jesus in his mortal body, was masculine, because Jesus himself said there's no marrying in heaven. It will be like the angels, and they don't reproduce either. So regardless of what form anyone takes in this life, the fact is that in heaven there are no genders. And so when this person said that, they couldn't just disagree. They said that they mocked my doggy icon and said, you're changing your dog into a sentient human with your avatar. However, last time I checked, it still licks its own butt and vomit. What a nice thing for a Christian to say to another Christian. This is the kind of servants beating their fellow servants that parable refers to, in my opinion. This is a great example that this is just bad behavior on the part of Christians. Why don't they see that this is self-defeating? Why don't they see that publicly, I'm just doing an academic debate here on linguistics, but this is going beyond that to making it personal, doing ad hominem attacks, and there's no place for this. This is horrible behavior by a Christian. And so this is just the kind of thing that Jesus is saying don't do, and that he better not catch you doing when he returns. And he will see comments like this, preserved as they are for the world, and deal with those people. If this person was harsh with me regarding, an unprovoked attack on my person, as a fellow Christian especially, he's going to take them to task for it, and they better keep that in mind. The next parables, 24 and 25, have to do with the Good Samaritan that no, it's the one on the prodigal son I mentioned earlier. Good Samaritan is about Jesus saying, he was challenged by someone who wanted to excuse his selectivity in helping others. And he says that this Good Samaritan parable, he says that this Samaritan, which the Jews despised, was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, I think it was, and he was jumped by robbers who beat him up, took his clothes, took everything he owned, and left him on the road half dead. Okay, and then a religious person from Jerusalem comes down the road and passes by on the other side and shows no mercy. And likewise, another religious person. And then, I'm sorry, it wasn't a Samaritan, it was a traveler. The Samaritan is the third person who comes and says, and has mercy, sees the guy laying there half dead. He goes over, puts oil on his wounds. That's what you did. You treated it with, natural things. And he wrapped him up and put him on his own animal and took him to an inn. There were no hospitals or doctors' offices. And so he leaves him there and then says, look, I got to go travel. Here's some money. Take care of him while I'm gone. And when I come back, if I owe you anything, I'll pay up. And so he did this. And then Jesus says in this story, who was acting like a neighbor to this person who was attacked and wounded? And they all said that it was Samaritan. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. He was talking to, I'm not sure if this was the rich young ruler. There's so many parables. I need to go back and refresh my memory on some of them. But the gist of it is that a neighbor is the one who has compassion. And if this despised Samaritan could be a neighbor, then what is wrong with the religious community? And so I said in that example of this fellow Christian tearing me apart just for saying that there's a linguistic argument that can't be refuted in the Greek and Hebrew, that the Spirit of God is not masculine, neither is it feminine. Even though the Hebrew uses feminine and the Greek uses neuter, it's not masculine, I can tell you that, and it's certainly not saying that the Holy Spirit is a woman or a man. That was my point, and this Christian here, supposedly, made very disparaging remarks about my avatar and insulted me, and I'm supposed to be on the same team with this person. So this is the kind of thing Jesus is not going to be too happy about when he returns. So he's saying that, you know, in this Good Samaritan story, that it's actions, not words. It's not your titles. It's not your fancy robes that makes you good before God. It's your heart. And the person with the heart is showing who your neighbor is. Okay? This Good Samaritan was being a good neighbor on one hand and showing that even, you know, a person who is down and out, you know, the poor that people tend to overlook and bypass and not show any compassion to, even among Christians, which is something I like about the church I'm hanging around in, you know, for the last year or so, is they actually go out and do. They don't just give money so somebody can do it for them. They go out and get volunteers to, for example, for Thanksgiving coming up in the U.S., they're going to serve a nice big Thanksgiving dinner to this apartment complex in a poor part of town. That's what Christians are supposed to do. And so, they're also going to give out grab bags of necessities that these people need that they deal with once a month. There is a ministry group that's non-denominational, I think, that our church works with, where people can go and volunteer and help them to collect some groceries and carrying them up the stairs because they're often disabled. That's what Christians do, and that's what being a good neighbor is. This Samaritan was showing up the Jews, and we're listening to the story Jesus was telling, the parable. And so we have two different sides of the good neighbor issue here. We have the one who was a good neighbor and the one who needed a good neighbor. And this is a lesson for Christians, especially the one I mentioned here, who was being a very bad neighbor at the time. Instead of taking me aside privately and trying to correct me if I needed correction, they did this publicly and was very hostile and demeaning. So it was a very timely example. I didn't, you know, when I was just waking up this morning, I just had this word parable in my head that I should do a hangout on it. And then I saw this comment. So it was a very good object lesson of its own. And that's what parables are, object lessons. Number 26 and 27 on this person's list is, again, if you weren't here before or earlier, these parables are not numbered. And this person has arranged them by what seems to be probably an order of teaching, not necessarily as they appear in order in the Gospels. So, and as I've said, this is perfectly fine because the Gospels are not always necessarily chronological within themselves, because that's not how you did history in those days. You did it to arrange things topically a lot of times, or to say just, you know, here's Jesus did things like healing the poor, exorcising demons, and then here's where he taught things, and then here's where he spoke of the future, etc. So that's how they would record things. So I have no problem with somebody arranging the parables in an order that you might not see otherwise, that could be very well the order he did it in. So anyway, the lowest seat at the feast is a lesson in humility. Okay, so because Jesus was observing that people tended to try to push to the front of the line, and when they were invited somewhere, that they would immediately go to the most important seats in the house. And he was saying, wouldn't it be better if you took the lowest seats, the back seats, because if you take the front seats, then you may be humiliated in front of everyone when the owner or the MC comes to you and says, sorry, these are reserved for more important people than you, go sit over there. You will be humiliated. But if you take the lowest seat, it's just as possible that this person might come to you and say, oh, you don't have to sit back here, come up here, you deserve a better seat. It's better to be honored by others than dishonored and humiliated. And you accomplish that by taking humility upon yourself and not presuming yourself to be important and better than others. That's the lesson there. And he gives another illustration with the invitation to a banquet where people would, assume that they were the best invited guest. Then, excuse me, he goes to the cost of discipleship, that there is a price to pay for following him. And in times past, especially in the U.S., it had been fairly easy to be a Christian in America, for example. It was the cultural norm, but even if it was superficial, it was still the cultural norm and easy to say you were a Christian and to go to church, and this made you a good, upstanding citizen. That time is long past, and it's used as a way to disparage and exclude people. And so in a way, we are experiencing a little more of a cost in our first world problems as Christians. Of course, other Christians in other parts of the world right now, as it's always been in history, you have the comfortable and the oppressed living at the same time in different places. There are people right now, Christians in certain parts of the world, who are suffering terribly physically. They're being robbed, marginalized, excluded, tortured, killed in terrible ways. So there's a cost depending on just, where you were born and when, as to what cost you're paying. Some people, as I said, in times past Christians have lived a very comfortable life. Others never knew a day of comfort. And so there's going to be a cost. It won't be the same for everyone, but there will be a cost. And Jesus promised persecution to his followers. And we're seeing that, once again, reference to the conference with that, where that comment was I just showed earlier, where even though Christians were allowed, there is talk in the aftermath, and it's almost looking like a setup, where Christians will certainly be excluded or shoved aside and not allowed to speak so boldly because so many people took offense at it, which, as I said, once again, they did not take offense at the heckler who was, quote unquote, speaking her mind, but they did take offense at the Christian speaking his mind. This is the double standard I've talked about many times before, but I'd have to commend Odal for being bold and in his convictions. I mean, it's no different than that being a flat earth conference. It's no different than flat earthers boldly going out talking about flat earth, or that guy we've all seen a video of who is going up to a former so-called astronaut and saying, put your hand on the Bible and swear that you went to the moon. And I don't know if it's that one or another incident where he gets punched in the nose for saying that. So in the same way, Christians who are bold in their convictions and go right up to speaking truth to power, as the phrase goes, are also being heckled and persecuted by fellow flat earthers. So it happens, and people are showing a lot of fear and loathing of Christianity, as has been the fact before that conference, but it seems to have been fanned into flame now, and there's this giant Christian, anti-Christian argument going on, and people saying that, Christians are swooping in to take over, as if to say, Christians have been maligned with the flat earth label for a lot longer than these young kids have even been alive. And so we are all too familiar with the smear of flat earth, and now the flat earthers are smearing us, and they're afraid we'll take over something that we believed in before they did. It's all a big tangled mess, but as I said, my biggest beef about that whole incident with Pastor Odal is that there's a double standard, and that fellow Christians are now attacking any of us who stand up for the truth. It's a truth versus non-truth war, and it is a war, and it's a spiritual war. Anyway, back to the parables. The lost sheep, I already that should be coin. That's a typo there. Lost sheep and lost coin, again, with the shepherd, and I'm not quite sure why they didn't group that with it, is when someone is lost, that you pay more attention to finding the someone and celebrate when they come back than you do with the ones who never left. And so sometimes the ones who never left get jealous of the attention. And that is more obvious in number 31, the lost or prodigal son. That's a very familiar parable that most people in the world know about, the prodigal son. And a lot of people miss the point of that parable. And very briefly, the story is that a man had two sons, and he was fairly well off. And one of them, the younger one, got impatient and said, "Give me my share of the estate now." And the father did, and he took off and squandered it in wild living. And eventually he came to be starving and had hired himself out to a pig farmer out of starvation, and was even hungry enough to want to eat the pods he was feeding the pigs. And that is what, he hit bottom, which is a lot of times what people need before they come to their senses. And so he finally decides to go crawling back to his father and says, "Don't even treat me like your son anymore. Just treat me like a hired hand." And the father, being compassionate, knowing this was his son, runs out to meet him, gets him cleaned up, gives him a nice fine ring and clothes to wear, and has a party. Well, the older son was out in the field, and he comes back and sees this party going on, and he wouldn't go in because he's like, "Why are you throwing a party with this guy who squandered his wealth on hookers and other things?" And the father said, "Look, he was dead and he came back to life, essentially. I'm just happy that I haven't lost my son, that I got him back, and everything I have is yours, and and I've always appreciated you." So this story is about Jews and Gentiles. If you look at all the context, the Jews are going to be jealous of the Gentiles who will come to faith. They were lost people. And Jesus is also, you could take it as talking about what he called the lost sheep of Israel, not the lost sheep of the Gentiles, but the lost sheep of Israel, who had drifted away from faith. And so he was coming to get them back like the lost sheep. And so with this prodigal son, it is like the son who died and came back to life again, which again is kind of a type and shadow of what he himself would do literally. And that is that the Jews, as Paul would write and elaborate on later on, the Jews would be jealous of the Gentiles and the attention God was giving them, and so they would turn back to God themselves. And this is what Paul again elaborated on in saying that the reason God turns away from the Jews in this time of the church age is to provoke them to jealousy, to say, "Hey, we were God's chosen people. How can you be, you Christians?" And so provoke them to looking into it so they would turn back to God. Of course, very few have, but there are groups such as Jews for Jesus who have done that and become Christians. And then this was a turnabout of what originally was the Jews were supposed to make the Gentiles jealous of their relationship to God. And that relationship thing I should explain, because it has been said that this is something that is an act of conceit by Christians or Jews about being chosen people. This is hardly the truth at all. It's a broad brush condemnation that people shouldn't use. They say in ignorance or hostility, I'm not sure which, but the fact is that if you are adopted into a family, then why shouldn't you say, "I belong to this family"? Why shouldn't you say that I am a child of this parent and not that parent? That's just stating a fact, and we're happy, and we say, "Look, you too can be adopted. Why don't you come join our family?" That's all we're saying. We're not saying we're better than people. We're just happy and grateful and spreading the good news. That's not conceit. That's generosity. So I'll get into the chat in just a minute. Sorry. Anyway, that's the point about jealousy of people saying, it's people thinking that there's something extra special about us. It's not about us. It's about Jesus and the fact that we're trying to, out of our happiness and gratitude, tell people that they can have the same thing. All they have to do is ask and humble themselves. And God will adopt them as his child just by believing that Jesus rose from the dead and put their trust in him instead of themselves for righteousness. That's what it's all about. And so this is not an act of conceit in the slightest. And yet that's how we're smeared by people who pretend to be friendly with us and tolerant. We've gone over the prodigal son, and we have the shrewd manager, which is an interesting one. People take it wrong and they scratch their heads when they read it. And say, well, why is Jesus commending the shrewd servant? What that means, briefly about the part about let me just say about the parable here. There was a manager who was misusing funds. He was to ingratiate himself with the people who owed his master money. He would say, "Oh, you got a receipt that says you owe $100? Well, let's scratch that out and make it 50." and you got a receipt that says you owe 2 bags of corn to this guy, you only owe him 1. And he was making friends of all these people who owed the master money by falsifying accounts. And the master found out about it and said, "You're being dismissed. What do you have to say for yourself?" And of course, he had really nothing to say. And Jesus was said, "You see, this is what the wicked do." He was commending this servant for his shrewdness and saying he made friends to take care of him when he was going to be thrown out. And well, let me just go there. Let me see if they have, let me open this in a new tab. Oh, a PDF? Are you kidding me? All right, let me see if I can. All right, where did it put the PDF? I hate it when it does that. I don't know where it went. I'm looking at my downloads folder. Hold on, I'm sorry. It would have been easier and quicker to look it up and do the search on it, but let me see what they got here. Sorry, I don't know if I'll bother trying to share that, but it's Luke 16, 1-8. It says, Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not, I had things a little out of order. Sorry about that. Taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their homes." So he did what I said about, falsify your accounts, because he wanted to be friends with these people because he knew he was losing his job. And then, so the master commended this dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. I tell you, Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This is very badly misunderstood a lot of times. And let me see if they elaborate on that. Okay, this is a lesson that you can download. And let me see if he gives his interpretation. Yes, he does. Jesus has been talking about tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, teachers of the Jewish law. And so these are the people of the world that he's really talking about here. And shrewdness, he's talking about whether this is good or bad. And he says that in this opinion of this writer, to be shrewd is to be keen-witted, clever, or discerning in practical affairs. The dictionary equates shrewd with common sense. It's a mistake to associate being shrewd with bad things like being selfish, stingy, greedy, cunning, or hard-hearted. So what are the possible interpretations? First of all, the manager is not the master's servant or slave. He is a free man with a high position of managing the rich man's extensive properties. He leases them out and collects yearly rents in the form of produce from the land. In this case, the amounts owed are very large. This suggests, as Leonard Fonck, whoever this is, in the book Parables of the Gospel, that the farmers themselves probably sublet. I was misreading that word. It's like, what? Subtle? No, sublet all or part of these farms to subtenants. In addition, they had probably conspired with the manager in raising the rents. Much or all of the higher rent was actually going into the manager's pocket, not the master's, so it is easy to understand that the manager, after giving the farmers proof of his friendship, would hope for the return of theirs in the future. Thus, the only person actually wronged was the rich landowner, but even that wrong is not so outrageous as would be cutting down an actual and proper debt. At one level, the meaning of the parable is straightforward enough and is provided by Jesus himself: to use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. Many early church writers enlarge upon this and add that you should use your advantages in this world to gain favor for yourself in the next. One says, when therefore anyone anticipating his end and his removal to the next world lightens the burden of his sins by good deeds, either by canceling the obligations of debtors or supplying the poor with abundance, by giving what belongs to the Lord, he gains many friends who will attest to his goodness before the judge. There's no question that the parable is confusing, since on the face of it, Jesus appears to be commending dishonest behavior. Every commentary I've looked at admits this is a difficult passage to interpret. Here are a few theories as to why the rich man commended his manager's actions. Number one, equate dishonesty with being streetwise. In the Message, which I don't approve of for the most part, Eugene Peterson translates verses 8 and 9 as follows. Now here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. And why? Because he knew how to look after himself. Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They're on constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate you to create survival, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so you'll really live and not complacently just get by on good behavior. There's some good points in there, but not all. I don't agree with all of that. Some scholars, number 2, believe the manager cut out the interest that was being improperly charged by the rich man. In other words, that they were actually doing the debtors a favor. In those days, records of a loan were sometimes inflated in order to get around the Judaic prohibition against usury. So it was the Jews who prohibited usury early on. It's the bad Jews who collect it. Usury, you have to understand as well, I don't know if they go into that. It doesn't look like it. Usury was when you charged interest on a loan to people who were destitute. If a person borrowed money out of necessity, they were starving, they had no shelter, whatever. If they borrowed money for that reason, it was very wrong, even among the Jews, to charge them interest. But it was not wrong to charge interest for non-essentials. If you could afford, you had all your necessities, and you wanted to borrow money to go into business and make a profit, or to buy some toy you wanted, it was all well and good to charge interest for that because it was a non-essential. So people have to understand that about usury. Anyway, the Jews originally did not approve of what usury is, which is in this case taking advantage of the poor and oppressing them. So what they're saying here is that the prohibition against charging interest, sometimes there were gray areas and the Jews would forbid the charging of interest for something where you could have. And so they would get around it by inflating the price instead. Okay, and you can find this prohibition in Deuteronomy 23:19. So this is in the Old Testament about not charging usury, which is, again, not interest in any and all loans. Thus, a loan of 400 gallons of oil might be written up as 800 so that the loan would appear to be without interest. So in other words, they're getting around some red tape here. They're getting around a bureaucracy, okay? And so the manager thus might be reducing the loans to their original amount. This is not a good explanation because the debt is probably not a loan. In other words, it was not loaning money for something, was that they got goods and services and had to pay for them. Number 3, others believe the manager eliminated his own commission. This would not have affected the master negatively. The editors of the New Jerusalem Bible, which is a Roman Catholic version according to this person, it was the custom for a steward to take commission on all sales of his master's goods, as this was his only means of making a salary. In the present case, the original loan was presumably 400 gallons of olive oil, 800 bushels of wheat. In reducing the debtor's bills, he is not depriving his master of anything, but only sacrificing his own immediate interest by forgoing his legitimate or usurious commission. It is for this that he is praised as astute. Number 4, it could be a combination of 2 and 3. That is, the manager jacked up the price without the master's knowledge, and now he was deducting the excess profits he himself had tacked onto their accounts, earning the gratitude of the debtors and the admiration of the master. The master is not being cheated, and he commends the manager's shrewdness in getting in the good graces of his customers who owed him money. Number 5, another theory is that although the master was affected financially, the incident improved his image as well as the manager's. Why else do business owners have sales? Okay, point. Number 6, Jesus is not commending the manager's methods, but rather his motives. Even as a wicked manager, he has the foresight and wisdom to plan ahead and look out for his own future. He knows that his job is ending, so he prepares a path forward so he will be provided for and looked after by others. This leads into verse 9 about being welcomed into eternal dwellings. Here, Jesus says, if even the wicked can plan for their future in their selfish and narrow-minded ways, are you planning for your future? Are you shrewd enough and clever enough, and do you have enough foresight to plan for this real future? Depending on where you are in your Christian life, any or all of these could be the right interpretation. No matter which interpretation you lean towards, the important thing is to apply the parable to your life today, which is plan ahead, look at the next life, not this one. As there's an old country hymn that goes, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through, my treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. This is exactly I think the main point of Jesus' parable is planning ahead, as this person is pointing out here, and that this isn't the life we're living for. These aren't the drones you're looking for. This is the life we have to take seriously because it will determine future rewards, but it's that future life we're keeping in mind, and that's, I think, the point of that parable. So in talking about children of the light, just finishing up this parable, he's talking about decent people who are looking forward to the kingdom of God, and they need to not be so naive as to give it no thought in this life as to how this is going to affect the next. And so then they go into a little discussion of money there. So I thought those were good points, and I don't know what happened. Oh, this was sorry about that blank white page there. But this browser did that when I shared the other, when I downloaded that PDF. So anyway, that's about the Shrewd Manager, which I felt like I needed to really go over because of its controversy. The Rich Man and Lazarus. This is a good one that some believe is not a parable at all, but a real account of life beyond the grave, or beyond this life. I should say not beyond the grave, but in the grave. It's because Jesus names names here. He doesn't give anyone's name in these other stories, okay? He doesn't even give a hypothetical name. He just describes what they are. In this one, he names a person named Lazarus. And this is not the Lazarus who he raised from the dead later on, but this is a different person. This is a lame person who was put at the gate of a rich man every morning to beg for food from people who came and went, or money, or whatever it is he could get from them. And he was, in poor health, and the rich man never gave him anything. And both of them in time died. And the Lazarus went to the paradise side of the time of the dead. This is before the cross, so nobody was really in heaven yet except the angels and God. And it was called Abraham's side, or Abraham's bosom in the King James Middle English. Abraham's side of which is called paradise. And the beggar Lazarus, I always put an "is" on the end, I don't know why. Lazarus went to that side, and to good side, where he was finally being comforted and soothed, as opposed to his life here, while the rich man, who was comforted and soothed here, spent his eternity in the bad side. And he says, hey, he could see Abraham and Lazarus far away. And he said, send Lazarus over here, Abraham, to just, dip his finger in some water and touch it to my tongue. I'm in agony in these flames. That's where people get the idea of hell being in fire. Although the Bible actually specifically calls a different place the lake of fire. When we're getting into that in Revelation, that flat out elected. But at any rate, the rich man is miserable. And he can see Abraham and Lazarus. Okay, again, this is before the cross. And so he says this, and then Abraham says, hey, look, first of all, there's this wide gap between us and we can't cross over. And second of all, you had it good in your life, and Lazarus was miserable, and now the tables are turned. And there's nothing anybody can do about it. It is what it is. And so the rich man then says, okay, fine. You can't help me, but can you send Lazarus? He's always wanting to send Lazarus because he was a nobody. And so he thinks this is continuing into the next life. But he says, send Lazarus to my brothers and warn them about this place so they don't come here. And Abraham says, no, because even if somebody rises from the dead, they won't listen. And this, of course, is an obvious prediction of how people would take Jesus rising from the dead. They won't even listen when somebody rises from the dead. That's not a good enough magic trick, according to many people. I know people today, some of my friends, who will say that, no, I won't, and atheists especially say, I won't believe in Jesus until he appears on my front lawn and does some magic trick in front of me. And we all know very well what they would do. And Jesus is saying that here. They won't even believe someone rising from the dead. So what are they going to do? What are the people today going to do with this much time elapsing? They would just write it off as a hallucination or a bad trip or a flashback or something, anything but Jesus actually appearing to them, which he will do at the end of their tribulation, and they're not going to be happy when it actually happens. But here in this parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which again I don't think is a parable because of the name Lazarus, it is a foreshadowing of what Jesus was about to do. Then Jesus goes on another parable of the workers in the vineyard. This is a slam immediately on the Jews, and especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, who were about to hand him over to the Romans to be horribly killed. They were the workers in the vineyard. And the story is that a man planted a vineyard, and then he had to go away on a long trip, which I think speaks of the amount of time of the church age has been, almost 2,000 years. He says, I'm going away on a long trip, and he put tenants in charge of his vineyard. And from time to time, he would send a servant back to collect his harvest. And of course, the tenants would get some of it because they did the work, and that was their pay. And the rest was to go to the master who planted it in the first place and hired them. And but the tenants said, oh, we're not going to let them take any of the stuff that we worked for. So they beat up the servant and sent him off empty-handed. And the owner says, okay, I'll send more people, and they won't dare do this twice. Of course they did. Then he finally, at the end, sent his own son. Hint, hint. Sent his own son, and the tenants saw him coming and said, hey, look, this is the heir of the estate. If we kill him, then we'll inherit this place. And I'm sorry, I have to answer the phone. One moment of silence. All right, sorry about that. Let's see. We were doing Rich Man and Lazarus, and the guy sending his son, and they said, let's kill him because then we'll get everything. And Jesus then asked the Pharisees who were standing around, what do you think the guy's going to do when he gets back and find out that his own son has been killed? And they said, oh, he's going to tear them apart and throw them out, and have them killed and make an example of them. And Jesus is like, yep, that's what he's going to do. And they realized that he was talking about them. They were the tenants that God had put in charge of the vineyard, and they had killed the prophets that were sent before who were testifying about him. And then now they were about to kill the heir. And they did it anyway. And that's half the this is one of those Inception kind of things where like in the Matrix, where Neo breaks the vase and the Oracle says, what's really going to bake your noodle later on is, would you have broken the vase if I hadn't said anything? Because here he is saying, you're going to kill the son. And because he made them so mad, that was one of the reasons they wound up killing him. It's really interesting. But that's what that parable is about with the workers in the vineyard. And Then we have one about several about the persistent widow. She was treated unjustly by someone else. She took her case to court, and because the judge didn't care about God or people or anything, but he's like, just to get her off my back, I'm going to grant her justice. And Jesus is saying, do you think that if you petition God for something, because he's God and good and does care about people, then why don't you believe he's going to help you eventually? You know, it doesn't always come in the form that we want, but he will do what is right. So he was the crooked judge. And then in the other parable, it talks here about the Pharisee and the tax collector, how the self-righteous person prayed to God in a way that he was like, thank God I'm not like that tax collector over there. I'm better than he is. And a lot of people think this is what Christians do, but it's untrue. And the tax collector is standing off at a distance and not even daring to look up to heaven. And he says, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus asks, which one of these people went home forgiven? And of course, it was the humble one. And there are people who think that Christians think we're better than others when it's not true. There are probably some Christians like that, but it's certainly not true of Christianity or Christians in general, and yet we're all painted with the same brush. Those are the Pharisees, the people who make those false accusations and think they're better than we are by making that judgment. Irony of ironies, or hypocrisy is a better word, I think. But then the king's servants are given minas, which is, payments, and they do various things with it. There's the parable of the talents that we'll see later on is very much related to that. Where people, and they're not literal talents, people take it that way, and they can apply it that way, but a talent was a large sum of money. And a very rich master gives a whole bunch of money to one person, a medium amount of money to another, and a very little amount to a third, on the basis of their ability. If you're going to have people go out and do investments for you while you're busy doing other things, you give the most money to work with the person with the best skill. That's just sensible. In the same way, God gives gifts to people who will use them, and he'll give them a gift that they're able to handle. And so when the master came back, the first person who had been given a lot because of their skill level and dedication and so forth had doubled it. So they had 5 talents, which is like, I don't know how many years of like a lifetime of wages. It was a huge sum of money. He said, I doubled your money. And the master said, well done, good and faithful servant. Because you have been faithful in that much, I will give you much more. Come and enter your master's happiness. And then similar with the second one, he didn't have as much skill, but he also doubled what he was given. And so he too was given a similar reward. I put you in, they put the first one in charge of 10 cities. He put this next one in charge of, whatever was in accordance with what he did. The third one came and said, I know you're a harsh man and you harvest where you haven't planted. So I planted your money in the ground, and now here it is. I dug it up and here it is again. In other words, it's like a farmer who would just plant the seed or instead of letting it grow, just dig the seed back up and give the seed instead of the harvest. And that's why he was a wicked servant, because he basically just buried his talents in the ground and didn't use them and just handed them back. And so the guy was very angry with the waste of his money that could have at least been doubled, and it wasn't the servant's money to begin with. And so the servant was wicked and thrown out, and what little he had been given was given to the one who had the most, because that was a faithful person. And the lesson is that this is a cautionary tale for all of us who would follow Jesus, that you better use what you're given if you want any reward, or your reward will be taken and given to someone else. But you can look into that parable. It's fairly straightforward. The same thing with many of these. And then the one about the 2 sons, Jesus says a farmer had 2 sons. He asked the first one to go out in the field and do some work. And the first one says, yeah, I'll do it. And then he doesn't do it. So he asked the second son, go out and do some work. And he said, no, I don't want to. But the second son has a change of heart and goes out and does the work. And Jesus says, which one of these actually obeyed the father? The one who did lip service, or the one who actually did, walk the walk? So that's an obvious lesson there. The invitation to a wedding banquet is another Jew-Gentile lesson that a lot of people miss. Jesus is saying about a guy who was planning a wedding for his son or daughter. I think it was his son. They always did, that's the way it was. But planning a wedding, and he invited his friends and family to the wedding. And when it was time and everything was prepared, he sent out his servants to go and get the people who said they were coming. And everybody gave them excuses. No, I can't. I just did some business. I just bought a field. I just got married myself. I can't come. And so the servants go back and report this, and the father is angry and says, okay, go out to the ghetto, basically, and pick up whoever is willing to come and dress them up and take them, invite them to the banquet, because the people I invited originally are not worthy. Okay? This is a Jew-Gentile lesson, or again, Jesus is saying, just like with the prodigal son, the people I invited first are unworthy because they rejected my invitation. That is to say, they were about to reject the Messiah. This doesn't mean all Jews. It just means, because there's always a remnant. If you look in the Old Testament, God never abandons the Jews because he made a promise to Abraham, their father. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob cannot be revoked. God does not depend his promise on the Jews, only on himself. Therefore, he will keep it even if the number is few. And that's the lesson between Jews and Gentiles. And in this case, with the wedding banquet, he's saying that, go out and get whoever is willing to come among the Gentiles, and they will be invited and honored and given fine clothing instead of the people I invited first. Doesn't, again, mean that God has forgotten the Jews or revoked his promise. It just means the majority of the people of Israel have rejected their own Messiah. And then we have the sign of the fig tree that tells you when summer is near, when it begins to bud. And there, I'm told, are also like these pre-figs that sometimes the poor would pick off and eat because it was a sweet little treat, and that this was a sign that summer was coming, and that when you see certain things happening, that you should look up and recognize the sign of the times. This is where he gets into the wise and foolish servants and the wise and foolish virgins. I'd like to just skip to that one. This is not about the church, in my opinion. Okay? This is about the Jews. Again, in keeping with all the other parables, it's about the Jews and their unfaithfulness. And the fact that not all of them were unfaithful, but what happens to those who were. Because in his illustration, this parable, he is saying that there's a wedding banquet, and people, in that, as was the custom, were waiting for the groom to arrive. Okay? There's nothing said in this parable about the bride, which is how the church is portrayed throughout the New Testament, is the bride. The bride is not mentioned in this parable, and she wouldn't be outside waiting, not knowing where the groom is. Okay? She is already either in the banquet hall or coming with the groom, but she's not mentioned because it's not about her. It's not about the church, which didn't exist when Jesus told the parable. It's about Israel. And he's saying that some Israelites are faithful and watching and staying ready and looking for their Messiah at that time, and some are not. And they'd say, we'll get there when we get there. I'll know him when I see him, and I'll just get ready then. I'll live however I please, and then I'll clean myself up just before it's time to go in. And Jesus is saying, don't do that. That's stupid. That's unwise. Keep your lamps trimmed and full of oil so that when the time comes, when you don't expect, when you've dozed off because of the length of time, then you won't be caught unaware. And that's what Jesus is saying basically to Jews who are going to be falling asleep as they are by this time. They fell asleep a long time ago for the most part, not all of them, and have forgotten that he will return. They just don't care anymore. And when he does, the Bible says they will mourn for him as for an only son when they recognize the one they have pierced. And so he is telling them that when he returns, and that there won't be time to be prepared. It's too late when they see him. And that's what the parable of the wise and foolish virgins is about, because it's the Jews who, some are faithful and some are not. Some are going to be ready and some are not going to be. Another one about the talents and the sheep and goats. This, I believe, by its description, is when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation and sets up his kingdom, and there are survivors who are still mortal, And there's three groups of people: the sheep, the goats, and how they treated a third group of people, the least of these, which my opinion are the Jews, and the sheep and goats are Gentiles, and all of them survived the tribulation. And he's going to separate them on the basis, separate the Gentiles on the basis of how they treated the Jews, is my opinion, given the context there and in all, among all the other parables and among his teachings about the future and so forth. So those are the parables of Jesus that I really did not go into detail about when I covered the New Testament, when I covered the Gospels. And so I think this is a very good page to visit, and recommend that you follow that link in the description. So let me see what's going on in the chat. I'm sure I lost some of my 10 or less viewers when I had to answer that phone call, but good to see people here at all. And let's see. Wow, Vic, 5:20 a.m. when I started. What are you doing up? Let's see. Yeah, useless comments. Yeah, you got to wonder about some people who, you know, would violate every principle of Christian behavior to attack another Christian and, you know, make fun of their avatar in a very crude way. That is just inexcusable. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, about the Good Samaritan, yes. See, Christians in the Western world are being tested. Yeah, in the West, we still have first world problems, but we are being tested. Some Christians are being, there was a very nasty porn bombing snipe yesterday against a channel, was minding their own business and just talking with some nice older folks about health issues, and suddenly they were kicked out and porn bombed. It always seems to be A, flat earthers, and B, Christians a lot of times that are picked out for these sorts of things. Look at who is always on the receiving end of these attacks and ask yourself some questions. And that particular channel, I'm not very familiar with. I don't know, just from what other people said, some things that they had been talking about, but that's certainly, you know, the people who would respond in that kind of a manner to someone speaking their mind are being no better than the Christian pastor that people have been complaining about speaking his mind. In fact, they're far worse. The Christian pastor has not sniped or porn bombed anyone. Yet these people who would complain about that pastor speaking his Christian mind and his convictions in a evangelistic manner that many flat earthers do, to go around saying about flat earth and being aggressive about it, they would turn around, some of them, and do something so horrible and force people to see things they'd make a habit of avoiding to keep their minds as pure as people think. It's so important to keep your body pure, but they don't worry about the filth they put in their mind and their soul, and they would do such a thing. It's just, you know, that's the one part of the persecution, and I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of those who do the persecuting against people like that. So that was a horrible thing. I just happened to be there just before it happened. You know, like I said to that person, I said hello, and I went to get some tea, and I came back, and there was a black screen, the black screen of death, we should call it. And next thing you know, there was the porn. So I just, there's no low enough place in hell for people who do that, in my opinion. So, and I'm allowed to have opinions. Let's see. After just now reading some of the comments, I'm guessing at that video I was just talking about, well, actually the Odal video, which are more than 100 last night. I'll have to go back and see what's been going on. I guess I would fall into the fake Christian camp. Oh, well, I don't even agree with everything Dean Odal says. Like, for example, I don't agree that the Holy Spirit is masculine. I have a strong disagreement about that, and that's what got the ire of another proclaiming Christian, I think. That was what that was. I don't know. But, yeah, there's things I don't agree with him about, but at least he stood up boldly in a room full of a lot of unbelievers and spoke the gospel. That's why he got heckled. If there were only believers there, he wouldn't have been heckled. But he spoke the gospel boldly, and I have to commend him for that. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and he is taking quite a lot of heat for it. But, yeah, it's unfortunate that Christians will turn around and say other things. I myself don't know all the details of what you're talking about, so I can't speak about that. But I can just say I don't agree with him about everything. Oh, hey, sorry you missed some of this. As usual, it'll be up shortly. Let's see. Fake Christian. Okay, the Virgin's parable. Yeah. It's my opinion once again, but, you know, as valid as anybody else's, I suppose. Teal's got a birthday coming up. Happy birthday in advance, because I'll probably forget. I usually do. I can barely remember my own. Let's see. Oh, Wednesday. Okay. Well, happy birthday in advance. I'm not sure what it's the day before Thanksgiving. I might be busy. I know I've got some cooking to do, but let's see. Getting ready for work. My sympathies of having to do that, but you know, work is not always a bad thing. It's if you enjoyed it, it's not that bad. Okay, that's Vic is talking about the show that got taken down. Yeah, she has appealed that, and she has every right to. It wasn't her fault. It was a sniping. They have to recognize that. I'm pretty sure stuff like that is automatic. You know, the bots take things down because it's so fast. You got to think it's automatic. And if not automatic, I'm sure that the people who did the snipe are the ones who quickly, immediately reported her. That's the kind of people they are. So, and in my opinion, people who make friends of known snipers are just as guilty. They have that same blood on their hands because they turn a blind eye to this sort of thing. It's like, you know, Stalin, who maybe never killed anyone personally. He ordered the deaths of millions. And so their blood is on his hands because he gave the order. And those people wouldn't have been killed, most likely, without his order, especially in those numbers. So, and this is the same thing with the argument, the classic atheist argument that Satan killed nobody, but God killed millions in the flood. Satan killed every human being who has ever died because he instigated the first sin, which brought death and mortality into the world and cursed on the earth itself. And so Satan is ultimately responsible, has the blood of all the world, all human history on his hands. So that's a lame argument that many atheists bring. Let's see. Okay, I remember briefly about Odell's rapture views. I don't agree with anything but the preacher view, but that's just a disagreement. I've heard people say that the green horse of Revelation is Islam. I don't know or care. It's just a green horse, but it actually is not the one. It should have been the red horse, if anything, because that's the one with open war and violence. The green horse is more the aftermath of that. And we have green horse activity going on now as far as Islam is concerned, even though their color is green. The fact is that they are already killing and beheading, especially, and torturing and oppressing anyone who is not Islam. Especially Christians in Islam-controlled countries right now. That's the worst of the worst persecution that's going on right now. And but I have to disagree with whether that the green horse is Islam. Islam, especially, I know it didn't exist in the first century. It didn't exist till the 7th century, and yet Revelation does look to the future. On the other hand, though, we have to keep in mind that this activity of that horse does not match Islam's primary activity, which is waging war. That's what jihad is, and not so much the aftermath of it. Yes, they do kill, but it's the killing, not the aftermath of the killing, that green horse is about. Let's see. Yes, he did speak the gospel. Yeah, people don't take kindly to criticizing that conference, do they? And here again, anybody who criticizes those kinds of people, without naming names, are the kinds of people who get quickly taken down and or sniped. There was another channel that got very quickly taken down after a certain critical video. And here again, you have to know that there are people who are silencing opposition not by inclusion and discussion and being adults about it, but by being evil and dishonest and two-faced about it. That's why those things are happening. They're being two-faced. Yeah, that sniping was not an accident. It was all planned and used to send a message of intimidation against people who would speak out against certain other people who are prominent in the Flat Earth movement. And this only proves us right. It proves that there's something more here than what's being told and more than meets the eye, and that it's not good. And so if you voice disagreement, speak your mind, like that heckler against Dean Odle, then somehow you're bad now, that speaking your mind is only good if it's against Christians. And you must speak in favor of certain movements. So anyway, enough about that, but mainly I wanted to talk about these parables because, as I said, I hadn't really covered them, and it was kind of something I felt like I should do this morning when I got up. Lots of good lessons in there, and here again, I would recommend that you go and visit this channel. So, sorry again about the silence near the end there. And we are hoping, I don't know if it could be tonight, but we were planning to do a Flat Out Elected hangout tomorrow, Tuesday. And given recent events, I would say everybody just keep your eyes peeled and keep prayed up, because we're all under attack, especially after things that have been said. Speaking our mind, it gets you attacked. It gets you sniped. It gets you hated. It gets you marginalized. Expect it. Pray about it for protection, because I'm sure that there will be snipe attempts at Flat Out Elected like they've had before. We've been sniped before. But it's been a while. We laid low for a long time, and I'm sure they'll be back, because it seems like there was a period of like a calm before the storm, before the conference, that there wasn't that much sniping going on. And one hangout actually thought it was funny that someone on their hangout had not sniped in a while. They thought that it was very good and patted them on the head for it. And yet, by doing so, they admitted that this person was sniping. And they knew about it the whole time. And they were approving of this person as their friend on the panel with them. So, like I said, blood on their hands. Anyway, I'm sure we're all going to get sniped from now on for saying such irreverent things against such publicly nice people. It's going to happen. So anyway, things to do. Catch y'all later. Thanks for coming.